You're listening to the Bible Uncut and Unfiltered. We believe the Bible doesn't need to be watered down or cleaned up to be understood. Our goal is to provide a healing place to discuss the questions you can't ask and the context you won't learn in church. I'm your host, Colin Connor. Now, on to the episode. We're picking up where we left off last week in Genesis chapter 3, verse 6. We've been looking at the fall narrative from a different perspective than what a lot of people have heard before, trying to actually get into what is really happening here beyond the typical Sunday school lesson. And so one thing that I don't think I've pointed out yet is that I very purposefully try to avoid calling this the fall as much as I can, for two reasons. One is because I don't think it was actually a fall as much as it was a failure. And two, because there isn't just one fall or failure here in the start of Genesis, there's actually three. And some Bible scholars have suggested that if you were to talk to an ancient Jew around the time of these stories and say, what do you think about the fall? They probably would have said, well, which one do you mean? Because there's actually three failure narratives in the first 11 chapters of Genesis. You have this one here in the garden in chapter 3. You have the Nephilim in chapter 6 of Genesis, which we will get to. That is its own study right there, but that is of spiritual beings, heavenly beings, falling from their position to corrupt humanity. And then there is another at Genesis 11 with the Tower of Babylon, often called the Tower of Babel. We will get there as well. And all three of those narratives are really about failures more than they are falls, and especially this particular first one, because to fall from something implies that you had a position that you no longer hold. But what I think we're going to be able to show in this week's study of the chapter is that the humans did not lose their privileged position as God's images and priests in the garden. So there is nothing that they fell from. It's not that they fell from grace, as people might say. It's more that they failed to achieve all that they could. They were supposed to take God's order and peace that he established in the garden and spread that out through the rest of the world. So it's not that they necessarily lost anything intrinsic about themselves at the time of eating from the tree, but rather that they failed to achieve everything they could under God. So it's more of a failure narrative than it is of a fall, and it is the first of three. So last week, we left off in verse 6, talking about the woman interacting with the Nakash, the serpent, and talking about the tree. And I spent a good deal of time talking about how I think that the focus of this story is to warn us against taking God's words and adding to them. Because when we do that, we start to confuse the lines between our standard and God's standard. And what happens a lot of times, as did here with the woman, is that we cross the line that we set up, see that nothing happened, and then end up crossing God's line as well. We're better off just letting God call the line where he calls it and trusting that to be best instead of trying to add to it, no matter how well-intentioned our motives may have been. I kind of wonder, looking at this, if the woman paused as she reached out to touch the tree to see if she would die when she touched it. And then when she saw that she didn't die, she moved forward with eating. This is a big problem for a lot of Christians, especially in fundamentalist circles, but even just in broader evangelicalism, that when your standard adds to the Bible, it will often lead to worse sin, not greater morality. It's people meaning well, and they figure if God draws the line here, how much better if I draw it here? But the next generation tends to be the ones who see through that, and they end up rejecting not just your line, but God's line as well. So in this story, I see a warning for all of us against doing that, no matter how tempting it may be. Now, last week I mentioned that we would discuss the presence of the human during this, the Ha-Adam. It's really not clear here in the verse. The text does not provide any clear direction, so there are several different interpretations of where the man was in this story. He doesn't show up until the end of the verse here, where it says that she took of the fruit thereof, did eat, and gave also to her husband with her, and he did eat. So some people look at his absence until the end of the story to say, well, he wasn't present through the whole thing. And then a lot of times people will use that to try to make some point about how the woman was only fooled because her man wasn't there to set the whole thing straight. And I just find that insulting to women, and I don't think that that fits the narrative. I think that's kind of just another example of modern misogyny being read into the text. And similarly, others will point to how at the end of the verse it says her husband with her, and assert that Adam was actually there the whole time, and then they try to blame the whole thing on his bad leadership. But I don't think the point is for us to be trying to blame one of them over the other. They both ate from the fruit. They both chose independence from God. It's not that one of them made a worse decision than the other. They both made the same decision. And the whole thing about her husband with her, that doesn't even necessarily prove that he was with her the whole time, because that could just mean he was with her right then. It could still apply if he had just shown up at that point. And to confuse the matter even further, because, why not? Biblical Hebrew doesn't have the same punctuation that our modern texts do, so the verse could also be read, she gave to her husband, and he ate with her. So if that's the case, it might even mean that she went and found him. It's not clear how much time goes by before the initial encounter with the Nakash, and the time that Yahweh shows up. There was obviously enough time for them to find a fig tree and sow leaves together, so I don't think that we can know for sure at what point the man shows up. I don't think that we have to. Ultimately, our focus should not be on trying to assign bigger blame to the man or the woman here. Both of them made what was ultimately the same decision, and that was to eat from the tree, signifying their independence from Yahweh. Now, with that, let's talk about why the man ate at all. Because the text doesn't give us a motive, so there have been mainly two common answers that have been brought up. One is that he was a wimp who just did whatever his wife did, and he knew it was wrong, but he was basically just a weak beta male who did whatever his wife said. And again, I think this is modern ideas being read into the text. I mean, we're talking about the first human couple in a paradise garden. I don't think that they were dealing with that kind of issue. We have to be careful not to read in our modern cultural debates about masculinity and femininity into the text and try to make an issue here that the text wasn't dealing with. The second answer to why the man ate from the tree kind of takes a line out of Romeo and Juliet and suggests that the man knew it was wrong, but he didn't want to live forever without his bride now that she had taken from the tree. So basically in the I don't want to live without you, decides to die with her instead. I'm not convinced of either of these positions. In fact, I'm very convinced it's not the first option, and I'm just not convinced on the second. I tend to think that the man was just as swayed by the serpent's promise as she was. They both wanted what he was selling. And this is just another case where the Bible does not specify motive. It's not usually interested in telling us why a person did what they did. It's just telling us what they did, and then it leaves open to our debate to think about why. This is a great example of how the Bible is meditation literature. It's supposed to be something where we keep coming back to it, and we can debate this, and it's okay. We don't have to come to the one answer of why did Adam eat from the tree. Rather, we can just think about it together and bring up different sides of it, because at the end of the day, then what you're doing is you're talking about the text. So even if you don't come to an agreement with everyone in the room on why a certain character did something, what you've all done is meditate together on this text. We would do well to lose our demand for finding the one way to view any given text in the Bible, and instead take the time to listen to other views, because then we're actually able to learn and grow our positions instead of just digging our heels in on the position that we already hold. I do think it's worth noting as well that a lot of this verse uses metaphorical language, like saying that their eyes were open when they ate the fruit. That doesn't mean that they were literally blind. It's speaking of the new power that they had gained to discern what is good and not good on their own terms. And people have wondered, at what point were their eyes quote-unquote open? Like, did they understand this at the same time, or did the woman understand it first and then the man did when he ate? I think the way the text is written, it's almost suggesting that their fate remained uncertain until the man ate also. And I tend to think that if he had not eaten, there may have been a chance for him to redeem his bride at that time. But again, that's conjecture because the text doesn't clarify. Now, verse 7 talks about their response to what happened and how they try to fix it. They sew together these fig leaves and make aprons. Sewing here doesn't imply needle and thread, but rather more of just pasting to their bodies. They may have found sap from a tree or something like that and just pasted on a couple of leaves. It can also mean to tie together. Even so, the amount of time that it would have taken to do any of that could have been used to address the problem instead of hiding from it. And I think this is another case where the story is set to represent our lives in a lot of ways, because we make that same mistake all the time. We waste more time trying to make our mistakes sound not as bad instead of just admitting them and working to move forward. We do this in the workplace. We do it in romantic relationships. We do it with family members. Just like the first man and woman, we are often more interested in trying to maintain our own sense of identity rather than just admitting that we made a mistake and moving forward with it. Who would have thought that a story with characters named human and female human would apply so well to all of us? Now, the word that the old King James translated aprons, it's usually called covering in more modern versions. It's really meaning just a girdle or a belt. A loincloth might even get across the idea. So while this wasn't exactly the stereotypical single fig leaf that you might see on medieval statues, it wasn't really much more than that either. This was not the children's book illustration of them wearing, basically a full-on dress, or Adam having, a little skirt on of fig leaves. Or even better are the ones where there's, an animal placed in front of them in just exactly the spot it needs to be to keep the artwork PG. Just always makes me think of an Austin Powers movie whenever I see that kind of artwork in a kid's book. But that's probably not exactly what was going on here. It wasn't much coverage at all. Probably just a couple of leaves just covering the general crotch area. And some would even take that to mean that the woman's breasts may not have originally been considered nudity, since that would not have been covered with this kind of loincloth. That's something that different cultures, even today, would differ on. In most of the majorly civilized world, a woman's breasts are considered sexual and a part of nudity, but not every culture in the world has viewed it that way. And it's just kind of interesting that there are different standards of that depending on the culture. That's not something that's necessarily Bible-based. That's just different cultures seeing that different ways. Now let's talk about why they would pick a fig leaf at all. This is the kind of thing where I'm saying we shouldn't just take for granted what the text says. We should be asking, why is this there? Why a fig leaf? Why not literally any other kind of leaf? That is an oddly specific detail to tell us. And of course, go figure, there is all kinds of debate over why they chose a fig leaf. Some people think it's because of its large size. Fig leaves are rather large and have just the right shape to basically cover a genital area for both male or female, so it could be that. Others think that maybe it was just the closest thing nearby. They were in a hurry, and so they just grabbed the nearest leaf that they could. But some have even taken that idea and surmised that the tree of discerning good and not good that they had just eaten from was a fig tree. And so they took from the leaves of the tree that they took the fruit from and made their covering. Now, as I mentioned a week or two ago when we were talking about the tree of discerning good and not good, that I don't think that was any kind of fruit that still exists today. I think it was probably a one-of-a-kind thing. But yeah, it's possible, and an interesting theory for sure. Another angle that we can take on this is to look at how figs are used through the rest of the Bible. And interestingly, they take on kind of an eschatological significance. In Bible terminology, eschatology is anything dealing with end times, or the end of an age. That has all kinds of baggage when we talk about that today. A lot of times images of Hal Lindsey, Late Great Planet Earth, or Tim LaHaye, Left Behind series, all those different things that color our idea of end times. But to extremely simplify this, because that's a whole other class for another day, in the Bible you basically just had two ages, two time periods. The age which is, and the age which is to come. The time that is, the time that is to come. The time that is, well, that's pretty obvious. It's the time that we're living in right now. And then the age to come is the time in which God is going to set everything right, get us back to Eden, sort of thing. So it wasn't necessarily the way that we tend to think of end times stuff today. It was more just the end of the age in which we are horrible human beings to each other, and the start of an age when God sets everything right. There's some extremely oversimplified Bible eschatology for you. Now, here's how figs fit into that. Isaiah 34 and Jeremiah 8 are the only other times in the entirety of the Tanakh, the Old Testament, that fig and leaf are used together in the same passage. And both of those passages seem to be talking about the end of an age, moving into the time when Yahweh sets everything right. Perhaps the most well-known instance of a fig showing up in the Bible, aside from this story, is when Jesus curses the fig tree on his way to Jerusalem. And he does so as a symbol of the Israelite leadership's unpreparedness for his arrival. It's a whole complex story in and of itself. But the idea is that the plant that was present at the beginning of humanity's age, the fig tree that they take the leaf from in the garden, becomes a symbol of the end of an age that was marked by human failure and abuse that continued from Adam and Eve onward. But at that moment, it paves the way for a new era of God's peace on earth with Jesus. So it was there at our first mistake, and it was there as Jesus sets all of our mistakes right. I think that's a really cool detail that doesn't get pointed out too much when talking about Genesis 3. Let's talk about the appearance of Yahweh here in verse 8. They hear the voice of Yahweh God walking in the garden in the cool of the day, and the human and his wife hid themselves from the presence of Yahweh God amongst the trees of the garden. Now, if we stop and think about this, the beginning of that verse doesn't make sense. They heard the voice of Yahweh God walking in the garden. You can't hear a voice walking. You can hear a voice talking, or you can hear the sound of somebody walking, but you can't hear a voice walk. Voices don't walk. So that word voice is really just a word that can mean sound in a general sense. It can mean voice, or it can just mean a general sound. And so I think the idea of this is that they heard the sound of Yahweh God walking. And contrary to popular belief, the Bible never explicitly says that this was a daily practice of God walking in the garden in the evening with Adam and Eve at the end of every day, just this happy little, let's catch up about our day chat, right? That's the image I always got is, God would just walk in the garden at the end of the day with them, and so he was coming in for their daily time together, and, it's just these, happy feelings, but that's not what's in the text. This is the only occurrence in Genesis of God's walking in the garden, and it's this one-time event. Now, could that have been a daily ritual that they had? Yeah, absolutely. But the text makes no such definitive statement. This is the only time that has him coming down to walk in the garden. And it's not even clear exactly what time of day it was either. I think a lot of people assume evening because it talks about the cool of the day in a lot of translations. But that word cool, it's actually the word in Hebrew ruach. That word showed up in the first couple verses of Genesis 1 when the Spirit of God was hovering over the waters. It's that same word ruach. The word can mean wind, it can mean breath, it can mean spirit. It has a diverse range of meanings that you have to determine the meaning based on the context. And so in this case, it likely refers to the point of the afternoon where the temperature starts to decline. So in other words, you tend to hit a peak temperature around 3-ish in the afternoon, somewhere around there in a lot of places, as the heat for the day has crested and we're starting to go down into cooler temperatures. But there's another option too. This could be translated as implying that God appeared in a storm. Thus, cool of the day actually becomes something more like wind of the storm. In this particular passage, you have to perform a little bit of linguistic gymnastics to get there, but it does fit the picture of other passages in the Tanakh where God appears in cloud form with his words sounding like thunder. You can think of Mount Sinai with Moses and the children of Israel there, where God appears in these thunderstorm clouds and people see lightning and hear his voice like thunder. And then the same thing happens with Elijah as well, where God appears again, on Sinai, in the form of a storm. And interestingly enough, that's another passage where the way you translate it could lean one way or the other. A lot of translations say something along the lines of God appearing in a still small voice to Elijah there on the mountain. But that same phrase could be implying a loud storm, like we possibly have here in this passage. I know those are two very different things, and a lot of people like the idea of God showing up in the still small voice, especially since that passage in 1 Kings with Elijah is the only time that phrase appears in the Bible. But there is a solid case to be made that it's actually not talking about a peaceful, still small voice appearance, but rather a loud, boisterous, thunderous, thunderstorm kind of appearance. I think that makes more sense based on the culture of the Bible as well, because Baal, or Baal as we often say in English, was often depicted as a storm god and riding on clouds of a storm. So by depicting Yahweh in the way that Baal was usually described, it was basically an attempt to insult Baal and place Yahweh in his stead. This view would also make more sense of why the man and woman were so afraid of God's appearance. If instead of the nice, calm idea of Yahweh in human form walking in a garden, you have this massive storm appearing on the horizon, that makes a little more sense why they would be freaked out. It could also explain why they heard the sound of his coming. It would sound like thunder. So I realize that is a very different image than most people have with this passage, and honestly, you can end up with either position pretty reasonably just from looking at the grammar of the text. But I do kind of lean toward the idea of God's appearing in a storm, just because of the cultural connotation it would have had with Baal. And speaking of the humans hiding from him, every single version I could find says that they hid among the trees of the garden. But trees is actually singular here. They hid in the tree of the garden. So to me, that sounds like the man and woman actually hid in the middle of the tree of discerning good and not good itself. They were using that to cover them, the very thing that they had used as a tool of independence from Yahweh. They were now hiding behind when he appears. I think you can also draw parallel between how the man and woman hid from God in a tree and how God would later expose himself on a tree to undo the consequences of their choice. There's a reason that the cross is often called a tree in the Bible, and it's not just poetic. I think it's meant to draw our attention back to the very beginning of the human story and how we made a choice of independence from God at this tree, and God made a show of love and forgiveness to us on a tree as well. Now, verse 9, Yahweh shows up and he calls to the human and he says, "Where are you?" With just a slightly different spelling. His "where are you" question is the same word as the first word in the book of Lamentations. Maybe there's nothing to that, but I think that you could see this as God's lament over humanity's choice. And there are some scholars who are starting to present this position now. I think the Bible Project has mentioned it as well, that this little wordplay is meant to connect these two stories. The story of the failure of the humans in Genesis 3, and the story of God's lament over Israel's failure in Jeremiah and Lamentations, that we can see his appearing here as his lament over their choosing a different way. I also think that the "where are you" question may not literally have been asking, like, where are you hiding? But rather, why are you hiding? Because if we look at the human's response, he never says where. He doesn't say, "Oh, hey, I'm behind the tree." He rather says why they were hiding. He gives a reason for it. So some people think that the question is more rhetorical. It's not literally saying, "Where are you?" but rather, "Why are you hiding in the first place? What's going on? Let's talk." If I can step back and speak from a therapist perspective for a moment, I think it's really significant that God presented that as the first thing that he says to them. He doesn't burst out in anger, especially if you see God as an all-knowing being. He already knew why they were hiding, but he doesn't assume it. He goes in, he asks questions, he tries to hear their perspective and to try to get their point of view and to give them an opportunity to explain their actions. We tend to view the God of the Bible, especially the God of the Old Testament, as being just constantly angry whenever someone sins. But more often than not, he doesn't immediately respond in anger, even throughout the entirety of the Old Testament. He usually approaches the person and he doesn't make accusations, he asks questions. Nowhere in this story does anger show up. We kind of read it in, but there is no description of God's being angry. And the only emotion that we're seeing of his here, I think that we could even read in, is the idea of lament, based on that one word. So he might be a little sad, but there's nothing that says he's angry and flying off the cuff here. He gives them a chance to speak their side of the story. And he does that all throughout the biblical text. He does it with Cain in the next chapter, Elijah on Sinai, Jonah outside of Nineveh, Peter after the resurrection, and connecting to Jesus' interaction with Peter after the resurrection, Yahweh asks 3 questions of the man and woman here, just like Jesus asked 3 questions of Peter then. We so often tend to assume that we know all the relevant information in any given scenario, and then we rush to conclusions and Facebook posts. But if Almighty God saw fit to gather more information before making a judgment, maybe we should too. Now, verse 10 presents an interesting discussion. The human responds to God. He says, "I heard your voice in the garden," again, that could be sound, "and I was afraid, because I was naked and I hid myself." Now, the human blames his hiding on his newly discovered nakedness. But I don't think that's actually accurate, for one very good reason. Nudity wasn't the problem anymore because he wasn't naked anymore. He had already covered his genitals with the fig leaves. So the problem wasn't with his reality. He had been naked all along, nothing was wrong. Now that he's no longer physically exposed, I think we can understand that physical nakedness in this story is a symbol of the greater issue at hand, emotional nakedness, or we could say vulnerability. Being naked is the most vulnerable you can ever be. There is nothing between you and the rest of the world, and that's why so many people are afraid or ashamed to be naked. They often struggle with their own self-image and self-worth, and are afraid that if someone else saw them stripped completely bare, that person would hate them as much as they hate themselves deep down. Have you ever noticed how almost every person has a dream at some point about being naked in front of other people? Maybe it's being back at school and you're given some sort of a class project and you don't realize until halfway through that you don't have your pants on, or maybe you're at work without pants on or underwear or anything like that. Like, so many people have that dream or some variation of it. Why is it so common? I think it's because we have a deep-rooted psychological fear of other people seeing us in all of our flaws and imperfections that we grapple with every day and we try to keep hidden from public eye every day. We're too terrified to face the reality that we're not as good at hiding our broken identities as we think that we are, even going all the way back to the garden. But God's ideal was never for humans to be burdened with shame and fear. He's been working since the garden to restore human relationships so that we could accept our healing identity as his beloved image and likeness. See, the rest of Scripture is really just an answer to your private shames that you are too afraid to let other people see without a cover. The story of the Bible is an invitation to you to give up whatever rotting fig leaves you've pasted over the private parts of your life and embrace God's vision of you as a whole and worthy person in Him without the need of anyone else's approval. That's the message of the Bible. And it's powerful, and it's healing, and so much better than what most people hear on an average Sunday morning. But that's what God's been trying to get across since the very beginning of time. Now, on to verse 11. Yahweh responds to the human. He says, "Who told you were naked? Have you eaten from the tree which I commanded you that you should not eat?" The use of you here is masculine singular. It's referring specifically to the man, that you should not eat from the tree. So some have suggested that maybe that prohibition on eating from the tree was only for the man. All we have in chapter 2 is God speaking to the human before he is split into man and woman. And at that point, before the split, God says, don't eat from the tree. So some people have looked at this and said, well, the woman was never actually specifically told not to eat from the tree. So maybe it wasn't a problem that she did. Maybe it was only a problem if the man did. And some people would then take that to explain why Paul is a little bit harsher on Adam in Romans 5 than he is with Eve in 1 Timothy 2. Those are two passages that we will definitely discuss more in the future and probably in a couple other formats as well. I don't tend to think that that position holds up very well. I think the prohibition on eating from the tree was intended for both of them, but I do have to admit it is a possibility, and it's interesting that this particular question of God's is directed solely at the man when they both ate. Verse 12, I think, is structured to sound like the human is blaming God by association. He says, well, the woman that you gave to me, she gave me from the tree and I ate. It's kind of like he's blaming the salesman for selling him a faulty product. He's like, well, the problem is with what you gave me, not with what I did. So in verse 13, God then moves over to the woman and says, what have you done? And I think it's important that we read this with kind of the tone of voice that I just did. I think a lot of people look at it and go, what have you done? But I don't see that here. I think he's not berating her. He's not blaming her. Just like with the man, he's giving her a choice to own up and actually not repeat the mistake that her husband just made. So I think it's more the idea of, what have you done? What happened here? And in a way, the woman is actually more loyal than her husband was because she didn't blame it on him like he did on her. Rather, she points to the serpent, the nakash. She says, the serpent beguiled me and I ate. And that word beguiled, it has a very rich range of meaning that can include cheating, causing to forget, entertaining false hopes. I think the idea is that she's basically saying, he sold me a product that promised more than it delivered. So in verse 14, God turns to the nakash and he doesn't question it. The Net Bible points out that there's a chiastic structure here. Now, chiastic structure can be a little bit hard to explain without a visual aid, but the simplest way is to imagine you have 5 lines of text. The first and fifth line are parallel with each other, and the second and fourth line are parallel to each other. So a lot of times this will be abbreviated as you have A line, B line, C line, B prime, A prime. And prime is the little apostrophe next to it. So if you indent each of those to be in line with each other, so you have the A's lined up, and then you tab over on a keyboard, you have the B's lined up, and then you have the C. So it kind of looks like a greater than sign. That is a chiastic structure, where it goes down to a point and then starts moving back in the way that it came. And it's called chiastic because in Greek the letter chi looks like the English letter X, so you kind of have that X structure if you extend either line out. The way that this works here in this particular verse is you have the man being questioned, that's line A. Line B is the woman being questioned. Line C is the serpent being cursed. B prime, sentence passed on the woman. A prime, sentence passed on the man. So you start with the man, go to the woman, go to the serpent, back to the woman, back to the man. So it just kind of works its way back to where it began. Very common literary structure in a lot of Hebrew poetry, and it shows up right here in this text. In fact, there are entire stories in the Bible that are based on this kind of chiastic structure. So if that's something that doesn't interest you, that's fine, but I do think it's something that's worth being aware of because it shows up a lot in the Bible. And also just goes to show how much effort goes into these stories. It's not just somebody writing something on a whim. They're actually taking the time to think through this and really come up with a well-structured storyline. Now, looking at the curse that is placed on the serpent, we have to note that this text isn't really an all-encompassing curse. We tend to look at verses 14 to 19 and call that the curse. But there's actually only 2 entities that are cursed here in all of these verses. The serpent and the ground. Humans are never cursed. I think that's really important for us to realize because, again, we often read in God's disfavor, as if he's just completely ticked off at humans from this point moving forward, and we're just lucky that he would even look with any favor on a wretch or maggot like me, and I'm lucky God doesn't completely zap me off the face of the earth. But that's not the message of the text. Humans aren't cursed. They're actually still favored by God, even after declaring their independence from him and trying to do this on their own. He is still working to be there for them and to try to fix the mess that they've created for themselves. So humans are never cursed. The serpent is, and the ground is. And when the Nakash here is cursed, a lot of texts will say cursed above all cattle or above all animals. Again, that word cattle doesn't just mean cows, but animals in general. That's a little bit of an odd wording, because no other animals were cursed here. Remember, just the Nakash and just the ground. So to say that he was cursed above all other animals, that doesn't really make sense, because no other animals were cursed. I think it makes more sense to see this, as some translations have put, banished from all the animals. In other words, it's saying that he was isolated from the rest of the created beings. I think the odd wording of this is intended to contrast with his earlier description as being wiser than all the animals. So earlier you had him being more arum, more wise, more street smart than all of the creatures that God had made, and here we have him being more isolated, more cursed, more banished than any other creature on the land. And despite common beliefs, I have to burst a bubble here and say that this does not imply that snakes used to have legs, and now they no longer do because of this. Remember, this was not a normal snake. This was not even a possessed snake. This was its own type of spiritual being. And I don't think this has anything to do with having legs and losing them. Let's look at what the text says specifically. Because you've done this is God talking to the serpent, to the Nakash. Because you've done this, you are cursed above all cattle, or you could say banished from all animals, and more than any other beast of the field. On your belly you'll go, and dust you'll eat all the days of your life. Now, I do think there is a little bit of a play on the idea of how a snake usually slithers along on its belly, but snakes don't eat dust, so I think there's actually something else going on here. It's more the idea of being humiliated or humbled. Other ancient texts describe public humiliation as crawling on one's belly, or even eating dust. We even think about this today. We kind of use similar language, like maybe after a breakup you say, well, he just went crawling back to her. It doesn't necessarily mean he was literally on his hands and knees, nearing where she was. It's saying that he was really humbled by this and was trying to show, I want to make this relationship work. Even the idea of eating dust, I think of the phrase, eat my dust, or something like that, especially if someone's peeling off on a car right then. So we kind of have the same ideas of these being humiliating images. And I think that's what it's supposed to be saying here, is not that this was a being that suddenly lost its limbs and now it has to slither in the ground and literally eat dust. I think it's trying to say that he's going to be humiliated and banished from any other life forms. And the repeated allusions to dust in this passage, I think, signify even something a little further. For one thing, they remind the reader of the brevity of life, but I think they also carry a prophetic warning. See, in the biblical story, dust is the substance from which humanity originated, and that to which it returns. And the Nakash is said to eat dust until he dies. So in other words, the Nakash is going to be eating up humans for the rest of its lifetime. And far too often, humans eat away at each other as well, participating in the destructive cause of the Nakash. Now, side note here, because I think this is awesome. The middle word in the Torah, the 5 books of Moses, is the word belly in Leviticus 11:42, which is a verse stating that snakes aren't kosher animals. The middle word of the Torah is belly in a verse about snakes not being kosher animals. Like, that cannot be a coincidence when the very starting story is all about a serpent-like creature that deceived humanity and led to their failure in this garden paradise. That's a pretty awesome Easter egg right there in the text. I love it. As we move into verse 15, we have to disavow ourselves of 4 common notions in this verse. First, this verse is not about why humans are afraid of snakes. Second, it is not proof that the devil is behind every bad event in history. Third, and hold off your stoning stones until I get finished here, but it does not predict a virgin birth. And fourth, it is not about Jesus, at least not entirely. Let's read the verse and we'll get into it. I will put enmity, fight, hatred, division, conflict between you and the woman, the you being the serpent, the Nakash, between you and the woman, and between your seed and her seed. It will bruise your head, and you will bruise his heel. So firstly, this is not about why humans are afraid of snakes. I've heard people look at this verse and say, oh, this is why people are just scared of snakes and why we're supposed to kill them. Well, there's no command in the Bible to kill a garden snake you find in your backyard. Now, if you do, I don't blame you. I absolutely hate snakes. But this is not about a fear of snakes. There are people in the world that aren't scared of snakes. Now, I don't understand that. I think that's weird, but you would have to wrestle with that and be like, if this is talking about why humans are afraid of snakes, well, what do you do with the humans who aren't afraid of snakes? And again, this wasn't about a snake in the first place. It was about a supernatural being that had snake-like form, kind of dragon-esque. So the second idea, that the devil is behind every bad event in history. And you might hear this as some people would say something along the lines of, the devil is just locked in this cosmic battle of trying to ruin the godly line of the woman. But this verse does not imply there is a single evil entity behind all negative events in human history. Both the seed of the woman and the Nakash are treated as if they are locked in eternal conflict, but it's actually their many descendants who are implied. The Bible frequently applies this synecdoche, where it calls a group of people by the name of their originator. Think about how the name Jacob is used to refer to all of Israel, or how the name Esau is used to refer to all the Edomites. Judah was used to refer to the two southern tribes, so forth and so on. It's very common in the Bible for the ancestor of a people group to be referred to when the people group itself is in mind. So this is not necessarily saying that the serpent was the devil and he's just forever going to be trying to destroy the line of the woman. It's saying that these descendants will be locked in eternal conflict with each other in an ongoing battle of good and evil. Now, the third issue about the virgin birth. I have heard some people look at this and say that since the passage mentions a seed of the woman, and women don't have seed, they don't have sperm, they have an egg, they have the womb, that this must be a prophecy of the virgin birth of Jesus. There is no seed of the woman, no sperm of the woman, so this has to be talking about how there will be a virgin birth. And that sounds great until you read Genesis 16:10, which is the angel of Yahweh speaking to Hagar, the Egyptian slave of Abraham and Sarah, and he says, "Surely I will multiply your seed so that they cannot be numbered for multitude." Now, I don't know anyone who wants to think that Hagar had a virgin birth. We want to keep that just at Mary. But the text uses that exact same word here. And the reason for that is that seed does not have to mean sperm. In Hebrew, this word can mean sperm. It can also just mean like literal seed, like you're farming and throwing seed on the ground. Or it could just mean descendants in a general sense, offspring, as some translations have it. And that's a better idea for it here. So, although people look at this and immediately want to read Jesus into it, there is no indication of a virgin birth here. This is just talking about the offspring of the serpent and the offspring of the woman. No mention of a virgin birth. And with that, there is no mention of a Messiah in this verse anywhere. There's an entire word dedicated to Genesis 3:15 called the Proto-Evangelium, or Proto-Evangelium, if you want to sound fancy with it. The idea of proto being first and evangelium or evangelium as gospel or good news. So this is said to be the first presentation of the gospel in scripture, that there is going to be a Messiah who comes and rights the wrongs of Adam and Eve. The problem with that is there is no Messiah here in this verse. I realize the word Messiah does not have to be in a verse to call it messianic, but if you were to ask a Jewish person about this verse, they would not see a Messiah in here at all. They would see this as being about the fight of good and evil in humans, and how we have the ability to be either a part of the line of the woman or the line of the serpent, depending on the decisions we make. And even though that's uncomfortable for a lot of Christians to wrap their minds around at first, I think it does make more sense. Because this verse seems to be implying a continual conflict between good and bad choices of humans, not a future destruction of evil by a suffering Messiah. The word that is translated attack or bruise, something along those lines in a lot of different translations, it's the same word that appears twice in the same verse. So like the King James has, "He'll bruise your head, you'll bruise his heel." A lot of other translations use the word attack. They are the same word. The Net Bible has commented on how that suggests a mutual hostility, not the defeat of the serpent. If the serpent's defeat was being portrayed, it's odd that the alleged description of his death comes first in the sentence. I'll pause there for a second. This is me talking. In other words, the text says, "He will bruise your head, you will bruise his heel." So if this is talking about the ultimate defeat of all evil and of the devil through the serpent, well then why would it be he'll bruise your head? Or a lot of times it might even say crush your head. Why would that be the case if the serpent then is said to bruise his heel? It would make more sense the other way around. You'll bruise his heel, but he'll crush your head. But that's not the way it's put. It is said, he will bruise your head, you will bruise his heel. So there's nothing about this that seems final. It seems like it's just an ongoing fight of good and evil in humanity. I will note that some scholars see this as not two uses of the same word, but actually two homonyms, words that sound the same, but are actually from different roots. So someone like Robert Alter translates the two words as boot and bite. He will boot your head, you will bite his heel. It's possible, but either way, I think you have to deal with realizing that this is not talking about the final defeat of all evil by a singular person. Rather, it's talking about the ongoing conflict between the line of the serpent and the line of the woman. And that is not to say a conflict between Christians and non-Christians. I like how Skye Jethani has put that the line of good and evil does not run between you and me. It runs between me and it runs between you. In other words, it is not us good people on my side and you bad people on your side, or, us good Christians and those bad atheists or Muslims or Buddhists or whatever. No, there is a line between good and evil that runs straight through every single one of us. No matter what religion you claim, no matter what denomination you call yourself, no matter what your history or where you come from, you have the opportunity to make decisions that are in line with the way of the serpent or the way of the woman. And we actually find quite often in the Bible that people switch sides. When we get into the next chapter, with chapter 4 and Cain and Abel, Cain starts off as the seed of the woman. He is a descendant of Eve, but he joins the line of the serpent when he kills his brother. A little further on in the Genesis story, you get the birth of Jacob and Esau. And Jacob is called Jacob, Yaakov in Hebrew, because he grabs the heel of his brother on the way out of the womb. They're twins born at the same time, and he grabs onto the heel of his brother as they're both coming out of the womb. That's the next time that heel shows up in Genesis. So you have a connection between heel here in Genesis 3:15 and heel there, and we're getting the idea that this little baby, just as it's being born, is grabbing onto the heel of his brother. That sounds like someone from the line of the serpent. And he shows in his actions through the story that he very much is a part of the line of the serpent. Just like the Nakash, he tricks and deceives in order to get his way. But by the end of his life, he has actually become part of the line of the woman, and he becomes the father, the patriarch of Israel. So I think that's a warning to us as well, not to assume what side somebody is on just because of where they come from, or what religion they claim, or what denomination they are. Anything about them. Anyone can change over time. And every single one of us, even the ones who go to church every time the doors are open, have the potential for good or for evil, to be in line with the way of the woman or with the way of the serpent. So all that to say that even though many people see an ultimate crushing of the serpent in Jesus' death and resurrection, they try to read it back in here to Genesis 3:15, no such explicit statement is ever made in Scripture. The Bible nowhere specifically says that Jesus crushed the head of the serpent. It happens in several songs that we might sing in church, but it's never actually explicitly stated in the Bible. I think there are a couple of passages that maybe hint at this, but the closest allusion is in Romans 16:20, and it's actually not about Jesus. Romans 16:20, Paul is ending his letter to the Romans, going through all of his acknowledgments, if you will, people that he wants to say hello to or say thank you to. And he says, "The God of peace will soon crush Satan under your feet. The grace of our Lord Jesus, the Messiah, be with you." Paul, thinking like a Jew, saw the archetypal serpent as being crushed, not by Jesus, but by Christians who choose to live in the life-giving way of Yahweh. Note that the verse says, "The God of peace will soon crush Satan under your feet." He's writing probably at least 30 years after the death and resurrection of Jesus. So we would think that he would say, the God of peace has already crushed Satan under Jesus on the cross, but he doesn't say that. He says the God of peace will soon crush Satan under your feet. This is an ongoing thing even after the cross. Our decisions every day are able to live out the way of Yahweh if we live how Jesus intended for us to. And I think Paul was actually drawing not just on Genesis 3, but also on Psalm 91, because Genesis 3:15 never specifically says the snake would be stepped on. We kind of assume it because it mentions the Nakash biting the heel, but it never says that he would be stepped on. Bruise your head, that could just mean to strike with a stick, it could be anything. But Psalm 91:13 is the only direct mention of stepping on snakes in the Tanakh, so I think Paul kind of hyperlinked those verses together. The verse says you will tread on the lion and the adder, that's a type of snake, the young lion and the serpent you will trample on. Now, a quick side note here, and really this could be its own entire discussion, so I just want to introduce this to you. The book of 1 Samuel seems intent on convincing you that the descendant of the woman that will bruise the serpent is actually King David. The book contains several references to crushing serpents. 1 Samuel 5:4, the Philistine god Dagon was decapitated by the presence of the Ark of Yahweh. Now, Dagon was often depicted as a scaly creature, something like a sea serpent. So you have a decapitated sea serpent when Yahweh's Ark shows up. Chapter 11 details Saul's defeat of an Ammonite ruler who was literally named Serpent. His name was Nakash. Now, a lot of translations might say Nahash, but in Hebrew it's a hard CH sound, Nakash. So Saul is fighting against someone literally named Serpent. Then in 1 Samuel 17:5, when David is going to the battle and he's going to face off against Goliath, Goliath is described as wearing bronze scales of armor. Now, scales of armor, that sounds like a serpent. And to make sure that the point gets across, the word bronze is spelled nakoshet, which looks a lot like Nachash in Hebrew. Oh, and verse 51 has David cutting off the head of this giant serpent creature. Even later exploits in the books of Samuel have David wiping out the Nephilim, which are all tied to Genesis 6 and the giants, and there's a whole mess there that we'll get into in the future. But it's a really interesting study when you see all of these hyperlinks to the garden and this Nakash creature that are strewn all throughout 1 Samuel. And it really seems like the author is trying to say David is the answer that we've been looking for in this. Another interesting side note is that the Vulgate, the common Latin translation of the Bible, reads, "She will crush your head," rather than "he" or "it will crush your head. And that enforced a lot of veneration of Mary in medieval Catholicism. No other translation I am aware of makes that translation choice, and it doesn't really hold up that well grammatically, so it's a bit of an oddity. Then verse 16 moves from talking to the Nakash to talking to the woman, and the controversies continue. To the woman he says, "I will greatly multiply your sorrow and your conception. In sorrow you will bring forth children, your desire will be to your husband, and he will rule over you." Now, there are two different words for sorrow here. In certain English translations, you get sorrow mentioned twice, but it's actually two different Hebrew words. So some translations might use two different words there, and that's probably a better option. While the second word for sorrow can include physical pain, the first word is actually more about anxiety or mental anguish. And interestingly enough, it's the same word that is used to describe the man's struggle in the next verse when God addresses the human and he says, "Cursed is the ground for your sake, in sorrow you will eat from it all the days of your life." So that word sorrow is the same as the first one here in dealing with the woman. And it's dealing with mental anguish or anxiety. So these two judgments are placed in parallel with each other to say that it's equal judgment. Now, curiously, a lot of people look at this and they think it's saying that before the fall, the childbirthing process would have been completely painless, no problem, and now because of human sin, well, there's very painful childbirth for most women. But that's not what the verse says. Now, if we look at it closely, we'll see a number of problems with that. First off, it says, "I will greatly multiply your sorrow." So that implies that there already was the possibility for some anxiety, even before the fall, because if God is allowing something to increase, that implies that there was something there to begin with. So that's the first thing we have to note. The second thing is that sorrow and conception, or this anxiety and conception, are what are put side by side. Now, conception is not the same thing as childbirth, and we all know that, but somehow we miss it when we read this. There is a common word for childbirth that could have been used, and it isn't used here. So I think it's signaling to us that the first part of this verse is actually talking about conception. But that raises a problem, because even though childbirth is often a painful process, conception is not. So a lot of translations opt for putting childbirth into this first part of the verse, even though that's not what it's talking about. I think the key is in realizing that that word for sorrow, or pain, is actually talking about anxiety. So if we take this verse at face value, it's saying that there will be increased anxiety regarding conception. That's very different than pain in childbirth when there was none before. God is stating to the humans that there's now going to be anxiety related to the concept of conception. And that is very true. Think about the anxiety that goes along with couples not being able to have children who want them. Or couples finding out that they're pregnant when they weren't expecting a child or prepared for one. Or what about instances of rape? There is so much anxiety that can come around conception. And that's what God is talking about here. And I think that plays out even within the Genesis story itself. Obviously, this still occurs today, but right within this book, there are so many stories of anxiety surrounding conception. Think about the stories of infertility all throughout Genesis, like with Sarah and Rebecca not being able to have kids. Hagar is basically treated like a sex slave. You deal with the complexities of polygamy with people like Lamech and Jacob, Abraham, others. You have cases of rape, like with Dinah and Noah's wife. Tamar with prostitution. The sex drive of Potiphar's wife. Like, there's so many stories throughout Genesis that all deal with anxiety and conception. So it's played out as a fulfillment of verse 16 here. Now, the second part of the verse, talking about in sorrow or in pain you will bring forth children, I think that could be a reference to the childbirth aspect, but the main focus of this verse is not on the childbirth, but on the conception and the pregnancy process, and how much, not just physical pain, but mental anguish and anxiety goes along with that process for so many people. And then the next thing that God says is that your desire will be to your husband and he will rule over you. This is another statement that can be translated differently depending on which version you're looking at. And the reason for that is there's not a good consensus about what exactly this means. Some people have looked at this as being something sexual. Her desire would be like her sexual desire toward her husband. But that doesn't hold up for me because this is part of the judgment. And sexual attraction to one's spouse is a good thing. So for God to be speaking in judgment all of these negative things and then say, oh yeah, you're going to be sexually attracted to your husband, that just doesn't really fit. I don't think that works. The main problem comes in how you translate the preposition to. Her desire will be to her husband. In English, we have several dozen prepositions. I remember having to memorize the charts of them when I was in middle school and high school, and never liked that. But in Hebrew, there are basically only 3 prepositions. That sounds great at first, until you realize that those 3 prepositions have to cover the nuance of all of the prepositions that we have in other languages. So there's a lot of debate over what any given preposition could mean when we're dealing with Hebrew. So in this particular instance, it could be that her desire is to her husband, like what we just talked about, but I don't think that fits within the context. It could also mean against her husband. Now, this is the position that I think a lot of conservative Christians have taken, especially those on the complementarian side, where they would say that the man is intended by God to be the leader of the family, and so the woman's desire here is against her husband. In other words, she is going to try to usurp his authority. But like I've mentioned before, there is no hierarchy in the garden. There is no man being placed over woman. They are intended to rule together as equals. So here in this verse, this is not a command. We really have to remember that. We're dealing with judgments here. This is not God's ideal for humanity. We are not supposed to look at Genesis 3:16 and say, okay, God intends for the man to rule and women are out of line whenever they try to say anything that differs with what their husband says. That's not the point of this. This is not God's blessing for humanity. This is his just stating the facts of what life is going to be like after this. So this is not something we should be looking to for guidance on how a family should be run. This is something we should be looking to as saying this is how families sadly operate post-Eden. And so the solution is not to have men ruling over women or women ruling over men, but to return to the Eden ideal of both ruling together. I don't think that that view holds up well within the context of the passage either. The third option that you have is that her desire could be subject to her husband. And this one seems to make the most sense to me, because like the rest of the verse, it would simply be making a statement of reality. This is not God saying, I am judging you this way. It's his saying, because of the decisions that you made, this is the kind of thing that's going to happen moving forward. You are going to often see where men take the lead and don't take the time to think about what the woman wants. So the woman's desires are going to be subject to what the man decides to do. It's not God saying that's the way it should be. It's his saying, unfortunately, that's the way it's often going to be. That men are going to get their way and run roughshod over the women in order to just have their way. And that's the way it's been in a lot of cultures throughout human history, even still still today. Now, no matter which position you take on this, I think the key to realize is that they were supposed to rule over the animals together. But now he's treating her like an animal by ruling over her. And that is not God's ideal by any stretch of the imagination. Now let's look at what God says to the man. He says, "Because you hearkened to the voice of your wife and ate from the tree which I commanded you, saying, you shall not eat, cursed is the ground for your sake. In sorrow, in anguish, and anxiety, you will eat from it all the days of your life." There's a couple ways you could read that cursed is the ground for your sake. It could either mean that the land was cursed because of the decision that Adam and Eve made, or it could also be cursed in place of them, which would be the idea that humanity maybe was supposed to be cursed because of making this decision. But God, again, trying to lighten their sentence, be merciful, and still find a way forward, says, I'm actually going to break the rules a little bit. I was supposed to curse you, but instead I'm actually just going to curse the ground. There's a possibility. Speaking of the ground, in verse 18, God mentions that thorns and thistles it will bring forth, you will eat the herb of the field. Genesis 1 mentioned that humans could use herb seeds. The next verse called herbs food for the animals. Now remember, herbs doesn't necessarily mean the stuff that you put on top of your dish for dinner. It's talking about plant life in general. So you had humans using herb seeds, animals eating herbs for food, and so now after listening to an animal, to the Nakash, the humans find themselves eating herbs like beasts, which I think foreshadows their gradual descent into acting like beasts in the following chapters. We have them ruling over each other like they were supposed to rule over the animals, treating each other like animals, and then you're going to see, just in the next chapter, that a human kills another human like an animal. And interestingly enough, in that passage, sin itself is described in animal-like language. Let me read for you a paragraph out of Dr. Sandra Richter's book, The Epic of Eden. I think she really gets across the main point of the passage. She says, "Where does anxiety fit into God's curse on us? What we find in Genesis 3 is that because of the rebellion of earth and the expulsion of Adam and Eve from God's presence, humanity will now live their lives in an adversarial world with a constant gnawing undercurrent of dread that there will not be enough, that their labor will not meet the need. What if the crop fails? What if the livestock die? What if a fire, a storm, or a drought? Can you relate? What about groceries for this week? Rent, mortgage and car payment, college tuition, retirement? What if I get sick? What if my kids get sick? I'm a citizen in the richest nation in the world. I have a secure position at a well-endowed seminary, and I still worry. And so do you. This is the curse of Adam. Limited resources, an insecure future, and a world that no longer responds to my command. Any other Adams out there?" End quote. I think that just beautifully summarizes that this is not God's being petty and presenting them with some sort of over-the-top curse on their lives. It's his saying, I had an ideal for us to live out here. You chose to do this a different way, and here's the consequences of that. It's not God's punishing them as much as just letting them live out the consequences that come from a way of life that isn't the healthiest. Verse 19 mentions sweat for the first time, and we'll be doing a short video on that across our social media platforms, so keep an eye out for that in the near future. There's a really neat biblical theology mini-study that can be done about sweat in the Bible, starting here in this passage and going through a good bit more of the Bible. Now, it's worth noting that nowhere in any of these verses does the concept of inherited sinfulness show up. There's a common idea in theology that when Adam and Eve sinned, they passed along something in their genetic code to every other human being after them that starts off people as being wicked sinners apart from God. It's very common, it trickles down through all kinds of theology, but it doesn't show up here in these verses at all. There is nothing, in fact, there's nothing in the entirety of the Tanakh that attributes any subsequent human actions to Adam's sin. It actually teaches that people can please God through their own righteous actions. There is nothing that says that Adam's sin passed along to all of us, a sin nature that requires us to sin. In fact, if you were to talk to an average Jewish person even today and say, what do you think about inherited sinfulness? They would probably look at you like you're crazy. Because most Jews do not see any concept of a sin nature that we inherit from Adam. Now, sure, we all sin. There's stuff that we all do wrong. But it's not because some person thousands upon thousands of years ago did wrong and therefore somehow passed that along in the genetic code to us. It's not in the Bible. Now, I will acknowledge there are a few New Testament passages, almost entirely in Paul's writings, that can seem to say all humans inherit sin from Adam. But theologians do not agree on the implications of those verses. As another conversation for another day, it is not as cut and dry as some people would lead you to believe. It is a possibility that you can take that position, but someone can be a committed Christian and not believe in inherited sin. Again, another conversation for another day, but I just want to point out that is not here in this passage. Adam's sin was regarding him alone. It did not then pass on that nature to anyone else. The decisions that people make in the story beyond that are their own choices to either follow in his footsteps or make a better decision. Verse 20 is kind of oddly placed. I think it's there to suggest that we're supposed to read it as Adam's response to Yahweh's judgment. But the man's tone is unclear. We don't have an audiobook version of the Bible, like from God, to say this is exactly what he meant here. So there are two divergent views that really change how you read the next several stories from this point forward. So let's read the verse and then I'll explain the options. Adam called his wife's name Eve because she was the mother of all living. And that name Eve, or in Hebrew it would be Hava or Abba, depending on how you want to pronounce it. There's a couple of different options. But Hava, Abba, that general idea. It's really hard to get over into English. That's why you have something in Hebrew that sounds like Abba, and we end up with Eve in English. It doesn't translate over great. But either way, it's connected to the word for life or living. So one position sees Adam's giving the name life to his wife as a positive thing. They were supposed to die after eating from the tree in the garden, so the woman's name represents their praising Yahweh that they did not immediately die. They have life. And I think that's probably the more common view. The other view sees the new name as actually a negative. By naming his bride Life, Adam was exhibiting further independence from Yahweh. It is Eve, rather than Yahweh, who would be the source of life moving forward. So it's almost like another middle finger to God by naming her Life. Now, I think most people would find the first view more attractive, but I think the birth of Cain in chapter 4 makes more sense from the second point of view. And we'll talk about that more when we get into chapter 4 next week. But I just wanted to present these two options to you here because depending on which one you take really colors the way you view the next couple of stories. Because you're either seeing Adam and Eve as repentant for their sin and trying to connect back with Yahweh, or you could see them as unrepentant and just completely starting off on their own. I'm not really sold one way or the other, but I think it's worth keeping both views in mind as you read the passages. I'm also curious about why the text says she was named Eve because she would be the mother of all living, or the mother of all life. Why all life? Why not humanity? All life is broader than just humanity. And I'm not sure exactly what significance could be drawn there, but it is a fascinating puzzle to me. And if you have thoughts on why that could be, feel free to reach out on the website or on social media. I'd love to keep that conversation going. Several commentaries have also noted that the name Eve, or Hava, is very similar to Havat, the Aramaic word for serpent, and the name of a serpent goddess in certain pagan cultures around Israel at the time. That could be another fascinating rabbit trail to go down of how there might be a connection or a comparison and contrast there between Eve and the serpent. As we move into verse 21, I think we're supposed to be scratching our heads a little bit because God clothes them with skins. He makes coats of skins and clothes them. Clothing someone is almost always an honorary act in the rest of the Bible. And furthermore, the word used for coats mostly shows up in descriptions of the priest robes. So I think that these connections are indicating that Adam and Eve still retained their priestly status even as they moved out of the garden. This plays into the idea that this story is not of a fall from their position as God's images and priest and priestess, but rather of a failure to achieve everything that they could have. They are still considered the honored images and priest and priestess of God, of Yahweh, even as they are forced out of the garden. I'll also note that contrary to popular belief, there is no indication in the text of what kind of coat of skin this was. I think a lot of people assume it was a lamb that God killed in front of them to make a point about sacrifice and getting back to them, but that is all reading a lot of the Levitical code into this passage. There is absolutely no mention of this being a sheep or of any kind of specific animal. Now, I think there is the death of an animal implied in the fact that it was a coat of skin. It's a word that means hide or leather, but there is nothing to specifically say what kind of animal or in what fashion this happened, or that God was using it as an object lesson of their sin. And verse 24, God moves them out from the garden. It's a very intensive form. It's almost like saying he divorced them from the garden. He drove them out, and they go east of Eden, to throw a little Steinbeck reference in there. Moving east in Scripture becomes symbolic of being away from God. It's a motif that recurs 7 times throughout Genesis, go figure. And it shows up all throughout the rest of Scripture, of people moving east when they are away from God. The first one that comes to mind is of Jonah moving east of the city to watch its destruction after he delivers the message to Nineveh. A lot of scholars suggest that this is because of Israel's location to the east in Babylon at the time of editing of this narrative. So east is a reminder to them of being away from their homeland. So going east is bad, going west means that they're going back to Israel. And Yahweh places cherubim at the gate of the garden, and a flaming sword which turns every which way to keep the way to the tree of life. And now it's time for Rants with Colin, the part of the episode where Colin comes out and rants about something. I will rant for a second here. Some translations, especially a couple of the older ones like the King James, will say cherubims here. There is no such thing as cherubims. Cherub is singular, cherubim is plural. So that's just a completely made-up word that should have known better, but they went ahead and made up a new plural word there. So it should be cherubim, or really if we're going with the Hebrew pronunciation, it is a hard CH sound like you have with nakash, so it's actually cheruvim. Cheruvim are placed at the gate of the garden. There's not a lot that is known about cherubim in Scripture. They are mentioned several times, but they next appear in descriptions of the tabernacle and temple when those structures are being built, because the tapestry between the holy place and the Holy of Holies was instructed to have depictions of cherubim on there. So these are supernatural beings. They're not angels. They're a different class of supernatural being that apparently serve to keep unclean humans from approaching the holy presence of God. We talked about this a little bit before, where that's not to say that God does not want humans to approach. It's that humans simply cannot exist in supernatural space where God is, just like we can't exist out in outer space without any kind of a buffer. Well, we can't exist in divine outer space either without some sort of a buffer substance between us and that holy presence. So the cherubim are there to keep humans from dying, from going too far, getting too curious, and going in where they're not supposed to be. And the only description of them that appears in the entire Bible is in Ezekiel. And it's chapter 10, verses 10 through 14. Their appearance was the same for each of the 4 of them, as if the wheel was in the middle of a wheel. When they went to the 4 of their directions that they went, they did not change direction when they went. For the place to which the head turned, they went behind him. They did not change direction at their going, and their whole body and their rims and their spokes and their wings and their wheels were full of eyes all around, the wheels for the 4 of them. Concerning the wheels, he was calling them the wheelwork in my hearing, and each one had 4 faces. The face of one was the face of a cherub. Well, that's really helpful. Thanks, we're talking about what this is, and you just describe it by saying it looks like itself. Not very helpful, Ezekiel, but thank you. The face of the second was the face of a human, and the face of the third was that of a lion, and the 4th was that of an eagle. So that is the entirety of the description we get of cherubim in Scripture. And if you are scratching your head going, what the heck did you just read? Don't worry, I'm doing the same thing, because I have no idea. Ezekiel's prophecies are like an acid trip. They are really hard to understand sometimes, and the imagery is very abstract. And this passage is no exception to that. So we don't really know what this looks like, other than that it is a very, very strange, supernatural, probably multi-dimensional being. So this is not the little baby-faced cherub that you're used to seeing on Hallmark cards and little statues that you can buy at a Christian bookstore. This is the kind of creature that if you saw this, you would probably pass out because you are completely freaked out at what you saw. And this creature is basically there to freak you out, to say, don't come any closer or you will die because you cannot exist in the space that I'm guarding. It's a trans-dimensional creature, something that can apparently exist in both realms to prevent a being that can't exist in the other realm from crossing into it. And I think we're even meant to conjure up images of other cultures that had half-human, half-animal creatures that guarded sacred space. It's a very common idea throughout a lot of ancient mythologies, that you would have these half-human, half-animal creatures, and their job was to protect sacred space. Probably the most common is the Sphinx in Egypt, and you think of how the Sphinxes were guardians of a sacred space. And it's not necessarily that the Sphinx itself would kill you, it represented the understanding that there was a power guarding this place, and that you were entering a space that was above your pay grade. You should probably turn back now. So that's kind of what the Cherubim are doing here. And you kind of have to wonder, what would that have looked like to Adam and Eve? I mean, it's stated so matter-of-factly, but they had only ever known this paradise with no hint of violence. Then all of a sudden, they see a supernatural creature with a pointy thing, and the pointy thing is on fire. I mean, this is the first time a sword has ever been mentioned. How weird must that have been to them? And if you notice in the text, it does not say that the cherubim were holding the sword. That's probably the freakiest thing about this to me. It says that there were cherubim and a flaming sword, which turned every which way. So it makes it sound like the sword was its own kind of freaky, weird, supernatural object that was there in between the cherubim. So I guess that just by virtue of seeing this, the humans were supposed to be scared and realize, I don't think I want to go near that thing. It also kind of makes me wonder if swords were originally supernatural weapons. That would kind of fit the picture that we get from Jewish tradition. The apocryphal book of 1st Enoch adds into the story of Genesis 6 that the supernatural beings who came down taught humans knowledge that they would not have had before, including the topic of metallurgy, amongst other things. But that story suggests that it was from these supernatural beings that we learned how to make swords and other weapons. Now, I know that story's not inspired per se, but I kind of think there may be some truth to that, and I kind of see the fact that these cherubim guarding the garden had a sword before swords would have been quote-unquote invented could be not necessarily proof, but validation of this view that it was actually a supernatural object. And then you have to ask, well, why would a supernatural being need a sword? What would they be doing with it? Especially if that wasn't a human invention. But that's not stuff the text is interested in telling us. It's just questions that kind of come to my mind as we're reading this, because it stands out as unusual. I also want to point out, lastly here, that there are some Aramaic and Jewish texts that have God, not just the cherubim, but God taking up residence east of the garden. And it's based on a slightly different vocalization of the Hebrew text. The reasonings behind it get into all kinds of really nerdy grammar obscurities, but I think the doctrinal application is important. Not only are humans exiled from the garden, but God is now self-exiled as well. See, the Tanakh tends to depict God as being geographically tied to specific locations. So this is his moving outside of the garden as well in order to be near humans. They may have been barred from the tree of life, but Yahweh moves himself within their reach. His location at the gate will even come into play in the next story of Cain and Abel as well. But I think there's some application to that for us, that even when we fail, even when we make mistakes, even when we sin, there is still a best moving forward. Sometimes we get so caught up in our mistakes that we just feel like there's no coming back from them. But God is all about making a new best with what we have. And he does not stay in some lofty, far-off position and wait for us to come back to him. He actually moves with us and is there with us in a very dynamic way to try to encourage us and bring us to make the right choices in life. That's really encouraging. See, God is always about stopping us from living in the past of our lives and moving us toward a more hope-filled future, even though that future may look uncertain in our eyes. He kept Adam and Eve from going back to the garden because even though the garden was good, it was no longer best for them. They made a decision and they had consequences for that. But God wasn't going to leave them alone with that. He was going to direct them to something better moving forward. And I think that's true in our lives as well. So there is a lot of encouragement that we can take from this story, and we can find ourselves in the descriptions of Adam and Eve. And it's important that we also see God as working similarly in our lives as well, that he does not leave us behind or judge us as too far gone, but that he is always working to move us forward in our lives. He's not about digging up the past, rather about moving toward a hope-filled future. And that is the beautiful message that the Bible has for us today. Alright folks, that is all the time that we have for this week. Next week, we are going to jump into chapter 4, and we have a lot to cover. We're going to be talking about Cain and Abel, why God picked Abel's offering rather than Cain's. We'll talk about the first mention of sin. We'll talk about Cain's curse and the mark that is on him. We will also talk about how to read Bible genealogies without falling asleep. So there's a lot of awesome material there. We'll look forward to seeing you next week. Until then, stay curious and keep asking questions about the Uncut and Unfiltered Bible. You've been listening to the Bible Uncut and Unfiltered. We hope we provide a healing place to discuss the questions you can't ask and the context you won't learn in church. If you enjoyed the podcast, be sure to share it with a friend. You can also rate and review on your podcast app to help other people find it. If you'd like to donate to keep our work going, you can subscribe at patreon.com/thebibleuncut, where you'll get exclusive access to bonus content. You can also check out our website, thebibleuncut.com, for recommended resources and more. Thanks for listening. We'll see you next week.